On the evening of 6 December 1943, as winter rain swept across Whitehall, Winston Churchill stood before a wall map of Asia in the cabinet war rooms. Burma lay marked in red pencil, an accusation more than a territory. For nearly 2 years, it had remained beyond British control. Japanese arrows still pointed west. The Prime Minister wanted emotion. He wanted victory, and he wanted it soon. Thousands of miles away, in the damp jungles of eastern India, Lieutenant General William Slim made a decision that would test Churchill's patience and defy the tempo of empire. Slim chose not to advance. He chose to wait. At precisely this moment, the British 14th Army, officially the largest force Britain had ever assembled, was not ready. It was malnourished, disease-ridden, and psychologically broken by earlier defeats. Slim knew it. His officers knew it. The men, hollow-eyed from malaria and retreat, felt it in their bones. To attack now would be to repeat disaster. Churchill did not see the men. He saw maps. He saw deadlines imposed by allies and rivals alike. The Americans were advancing across the Pacific. The Soviets were grinding westward. Britain, he feared, was falling behind. Burma was not a sideshow to him. It was a test of national will. On paper, Slim's hesitation looked like defiance. In reality, it was survival. Slim had inherited an army that no longer believed it could win. Columns had collapsed in 1942. Entire divisions had dissolved under pressure. The jungle had become synonymous with humiliation. Before any advance could begin, that legacy had to be broken. This was the silent conflict now unfolding: speed versus strength. Pressure versus patience. One man demanded action to satisfy the global strategy. The other demanded time to rebuild an army from the inside out. Neither would yield easily. And in that gap between London's urgency and Burma's reality, the fate of an entire campaign hung suspended. The tension between London and the front did not arise overnight. It had been accumulating since the collapse of British power in Southeast Asia in early 1942. Singapore had fallen in 70 days. Rangoon had been abandoned in March. By the time Slim took command of the remnants of the Burma Corps, the British Army in Asia carried the stigma of defeat more heavily than any other force in the empire. Churchill never forgave that failure. In private memoranda, he described Burma as a reproach which gnaws at our prestige. He demanded action not only to regain territory, but to restore Britain's authority in Asia. Every month of delay, he believed, deepened the wound. Slim understood the political stakes. He also understood the military truth. The Japanese 15th Army had mastered jungle warfare. They moved light, lived off the land, and struck with ruthless confidence. British doctrine, by contrast, was built for roads, supply depots, and certainty. In the Burmese jungle, certainty did not exist. By mid-1943, Churchill pressed harder. Telegrams arrived from London with increasing urgency. Plans were demanded. Timetables were questioned. One message, stripped of diplomatic courtesy, asked why British forces could not simply advance as the Americans had done in New Guinea. Slim's response was measured, almost cold. He wrote that before any offensive, the army had to be transformed. Training had to be ruthless. Supply had to come from the air. Most of all, the men had to believe that the jungle was not the enemy. Behind closed doors, Slim began rebuilding in ways that defied tradition. He sacked officers who clung to parade ground thinking. He promoted those who understood movement, endurance, and improvisation. Units trained for months in monsoon rain. Men learned to fight surrounded, to hold ground without retreat, to trust aircraft as lifelines. Churchill saw none of this. What he saw were reports stamped, "No major movement anticipated until 1944. His frustration sharpened. At conferences in Cairo and Tehran, he spoke of Burma as unfinished business. Allies listened politely, rivals took note. Britain, he feared, was being judged by its inaction. Slim, meanwhile, watched his soldiers change. Disease rates fell, confidence rose. Patrols no longer avoided the jungle, they owned it. This transformation could not be rushed. Slim knew that one premature attack would erase everything he had built. The divide between the prime minister and his general was now absolute. One demanded speed for the sake of power, the other demanded patience for the sake of victory. Only one of them would be proven right. By the autumn of 1943, the pressure reached its breaking point. Churchill's messages grew sharper, their language increasingly impatient. He questioned whether command in India lacked the necessary spark. He hinted, without stating it outright, that delay itself had become a form of failure. Slim felt the weight of those words, but he did not bend. He had seen what premature action cost in Burma. Annihilated columns, men eaten by the jungle before the enemy ever appeared. This time, he would not gamble with lives to satisfy distant expectations. In October, Slim made his position unmistakable. He informed his superiors that the 14th Army would not advance until it could defeat the Japanese on equal terms or better. "We shall fight them on our own ground," he wrote, meaning the jungle itself. It was not rhetoric, it was a declaration of method. The Japanese, meanwhile, were watching. Intelligence reports intercepted by British codebreakers suggested that Tokyo believed the British incapable of sustained jungle warfare. Japanese commanders planned accordingly. They expected retreat. They expected collapse. Slim intended to give them neither. The transformation he had ordered was now nearing completion. Troops were trained to hold isolated positions for weeks. Supply drops by Dakota aircraft became routine, not experimental. Artillery units learned to fire blind through the jungle canopy. For the first time, the British Army in Asia was no longer dependent on roads. Churchill remained unconvinced. In November, he asked bluntly whether Slim's army intended to fight at all. The implication was clear. Patience had become indistinguishable from paralysis. Slim did not respond in anger. He responded with silence and preparation. By December, the Japanese made their move. Believing Slim hesitant and defensive, they launched a major offensive towards Imphal, aiming to destroy the 14th Army before it could advance. It was the very test Slim had anticipated, the moment he had been waiting for. The battlefield would decide what telegrams could not. As Japanese divisions crossed the Chinwin River, Slim issued orders that stunned both sides. British units were told not to withdraw. They were to dig in, hold, and let the enemy come. Supply would arrive by air. Retreat was no longer a doctrine. This was the point of no return. If Slim was wrong, the 14th Army would be encircled and destroyed. If he was right, the entire balance of the Burma campaign would shift in a single season. Far away in London, Churchill waited for news. Impatient, skeptical, and unaware that the gamble he had resisted was about to justify itself. The decisive moment came in March 1944 in the hills and plains around Imphal and Kohima. Japanese forces, nearly 85,000 strong, advanced with confidence born of past victories. They expected hunger, panic, and retreat. Instead, they found British and Indian troops standing their ground, supplied entirely from the air, refusing to break. Slim's order held. No withdrawal, no collapse. For weeks, the 14th Army endured encirclement. Aircraft flew day and night, dropping food, ammunition, and medicine into shrinking perimeters. Wounded men were flown out. Reinforcements were flown in. The jungle, once a trap, became a shield. The Japanese had not planned for this. Their logistics collapsed. Starvation set in. Malaria and exhaustion spread through their ranks with merciless speed. Officers recorded in diaries that the enemy no longer fled as expected. British units counterattacked instead of dissolving. At Kohima, fighting narrowed to yards. At Imphal, the siege dragged on under relentless rain. By May, the Japanese offensive had failed completely. More than 50,000 of their soldiers lay dead, many without ever seeing an enemy rifle. It was the greatest land defeat Japan had yet suffered. Only then did Churchill fully grasp what Slim had done. Reports reaching London no longer spoke of delay or hesitation. They spoke of annihilated divisions and the shattered enemy offensive. The 14th Army, once dismissed as incapable, had become the dominant force in the theater. Churchill's reaction was restrained but unmistakable. In private correspondence, his tone shifted. Doubt gave way to respect. He acknowledged that Slim had forged an army where none existed before. The choice to wait, to rebuild rather than rush, had proven irreversible in its consequences. The Japanese would never again mount a serious offensive in India. From that point forward, they would only retreat. Slim did not celebrate. He pressed on. With the enemy broken, the road to Mandalay and Rangoon lay open. The advance he had postponed now began with unstoppable momentum. The cost of impatience would have been annihilation. The reward for restraint was dominance. The argument between the prime minister and the general was over, not because it had been settled in London, but because it had been decided in blood and terrain. By early 1945, the consequences of Slim's decision were unmistakable. The 14th Army advanced across Burma with a confidence no British force in Asia had possessed since the war began. Mandalay fell in March. Rangoon followed in May. The Japanese retreated in fragments, no longer masters of the jungle they had once ruled. What had begun as hesitation was now revealed as transformation. Churchill, reviewing the campaign's final reports, recognized the deeper truth. Victory in Burma had not come from bold improvisation or sudden brilliance, but from the slow, deliberate rebuilding of human endurance. Slim had understood something Churchill, in his urgency, could not afford to see, that broken armies cannot be commanded into greatness. They must be remade. The 14th Army earned a new name among its soldiers, the Forgotten Army, not for neglect, but for how quietly it had altered the course of the war. It tied down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops. It restored British credibility in Asia. It proved that defeat, if confronted honestly, could be reversed. For Slim, the campaign marked the apex of a career defined not by ambition, but by responsibility. He never spoke of defying Churchill. He spoke only of refusing to waste lives. His restraint had outlasted political pressure, and in doing so, reshaped strategy itself. For Churchill, the lesson was harder. Burma forced him to accept that power did not always move at the pace of will, that some victories required waiting while others demanded action, that pressure, applied without understanding, could destroy what it sought to accelerate. This was not merely a campaign won, it was an era concluded, the end of Britain's assumption that command alone guaranteed obedience from reality. After Burma, strategy would be measured more carefully. Authority would listen longer. Because in the jungles of Asia, one general proved that patience, once chosen, could not be undone, and that waiting, when done deliberately, could decide the fate of empires.